Welcome to today's Explorer Talks that we are broadcasting through our Twitch Explorer by X channel. My name is Helena or Elena, and it is a pleasure to be your host today. Before we meet our guest, let's travel back in time. In October 2015, two longtime friends and entrepreneurs, Jennifer and Mara, started sharing some stories about the challenge of founding their startups. The thing is, they had created for-profit companies with purpose to discover that this type of company was basically unfundable in the prevailing paradigm at the time, which in essence was or is actually social impact investors or venture capitalists. So following this conversation in February 2016, they wrote Sex and Startups, a blog post that made the case for alternative financing models for companies like theirs. To their surprise, they received responses from hundreds of supporters, including Anilla and Astrid. So they got in touch with Jennifer and Mara through social media, began collaborating with other entrepreneurs and brewing a new concept that would offer a more complete alternative to the unicorn, the zebra. A year after Sex and Startups was published in March 2017, they published another post, Zebras Fix What Unicorns Break. And our four protagonists were overwhelmed by the response. Over 10,000 founders, investors, lawyers, accountants, philanthropists, and other people reacted to the article with a common sentiment. You describe what I am, or you describe what I want to be, or you describe what I want to invest in. They had just given name to something that had been brewing for a while, a collective sense, although individually experienced, that something is deeply wrong with the prevailing narrative of startups and IPOs hungry founders with their aggressive thirst for market power. Zebras United, a new movement was born. And to tell us more about it, we are lucky to have with us one of his four co-founders. She describes herself as an impatient pragmatist, recovering nonprofit executive turned tech entrepreneur, but there is much more to her. So let's hear directly from her. Welcome, Dr. Astrid Scholz. Astrid.
Thank you very much for that very warm welcome, Elena, and it's very good to be with you all. I am very pleased to be coming to you from Portland, Oregon, where it's only 9 o'clock in the morning. I've been enjoying this new world of virtual gatherings, and I hope you all are as well. And maybe I'll just pick up where you left off, Elena.
Astrid, let me just remind our viewers, the audience, that well, you're going to have a 10-minute brief keynote to give us some of the basic on the Zebra Unite and put us in the context of your work. Then we will have a fireside chat, you and I, with some questions. And after that, you, the audience, will be able to well, send your questions to Astrid through the Twitch chat. But you can start sending the questions now. So by the time we finish, we already have them. I'm going to send them to me through WhatsApp. So start sending your questions through the chat. I will pass them on to Astrid when we finish the fireside chat. And then after that, the Explorer participants will have a very private and exclusive discussion with Astrid. So Astrid, to get the ball rolling, what is Zebra Unite? What is a Zebra company? And how does it compare with a unicorn one?
Wonderful. Well, let me jump right in there and pick up where you left off and describe to you why I became a zebra and what makes a zebra company, using the example of my own company, Amalaria, which is a technology and system design firm. As Elena said in her introduction of me, I sometimes describe myself as a recovering nonprofit executive turned tech entrepreneur. And let me tell you about that journey a little bit. So I was working for a good-sized US-based conservation organization that was doing very innovative work, thinking about new investment models for forest restoration, that was doing some great work in marine conservation and with native communities all over the west coast of the United States. And about 10 years ago, we started thinking about, what would it look like, to share those innovations with other people in other parts of the world. My organization was very focused on just one bioregion. And we thought, well, technology can help to share what's already working. So my motivation in creating the company, I left the nonprofit organization as president to spin out what had become a technology idea that we called the Resilience Exchange. And I say this to the explorers in the audience because I know you're all in the process of creating new social enterprises. So essentially, we had incubated a technology social enterprise that was sort of taking the logic of GitHub and to say, there are lots and lots of great social and environmental innovations all over the world. We just need to share them. And my organization, where I had come from, is focused here on the West Coast of North America. We would never go and become active in Spain or in China or in Africa, you name it. So the idea for this company, Armalaria, was born initially around the product that we called the Resilience Exchange, to basically create a platform where practitioners from all over the world could discover what's already working so that they could build on top of what was already working and share with each other and thereby accelerate the pace of social change, a topic very near and dear to my heart. But here's what happened. I had been a very successful nonprofit executive, nonprofit program manager. I was incredibly successful at raising money. I had almost a perfect, 100% success rate with raising grant funding. But when I stepped out as a now technology entrepreneur about 6 years ago, a strange thing happened. All of a sudden, apparently my sales skills were no longer good. I could not find venture capitalists who were interested in this company. I could not get any angel investors interested in it. Everybody was sort of nodding politely. And very quickly, what I realized is I was getting some very odd questions about my company. I was getting questions about, whether or not I had thought enough about the risks associated with it, for example. And I realized I was falling into a pattern that is very prevalent, where in venture capital, where, for example, women or people of color or older entrepreneurs don't receive financing. Right. And so my sense was, and it began building in 2015, that there's something very wrong with this new industry I was finding myself in. That all of a sudden, the same sales skills that had seen me through 15 years in the nonprofit world, all of a sudden were failing. That didn't seem right. Right. I'm the same person. I know how to sell. Why am I not able to sell to investors? And the short answer is because there are these structural and systemic barriers to entrepreneurs that don't look like the usual suspects in Silicon Valley. So I was beginning to feel some anger and some rage, if you will, at the situation. And it's at that moment in early 2016 that I came across Sex and Startups. And immediately it resonated with me because it was describing this experience that so many entrepreneurs have who don't happen to be young and white and male. And so immediately there was a resonance. And of course, if you hadn't read Sex and Startups yet, it creates an extended metaphor for how venture capital works currently based on the male reproductive anatomy. So it's highly recommended as a piece of reading. And my sense immediately was this really hits the nail on the head in terms of my own experience. And I should, before I go into what Zebras Unite is and how that came about, I will also say, if venture capital was bad, it's not like impact investors were any better. And here's the secret, right? So I would talk to, and we had in our founding group, we had some high profile nonprofit organizations and foundations and whatnot. But when we took the idea of the Resilience Exchange to the impact investing side of foundations, for example, you know what they told me? They told me the exact same thing that the venture capitalists did. They said, oh, come back to us when you have $1 million in ARR, annual recurring revenue. And I said, well, this is no better than the venture capitalists I'm talking to. So I was caught between a rock and a hard place, right? Because the technology investors don't understand impact. The impact investors don't understand technology. And they're both using the same investing paradigm that is looking for essentially a company that has the potential to be high growth, is motivated by a quick exit, and is looking for that hockey stick growth, right? And that's the classic unicorn that Eileen Lee defined at Cowboy Ventures as a company that has a market capitalization of at least $1 billion, right? That's the definition of a unicorn. So if you're not building a unicorn or you don't want to build a unicorn, you're just out of luck in both the venture capital world and in the impact investing world, interestingly, or in parts of the impact investing world, I should say. So then in 2015, that was beginning to build for myself. In 2016, I read Jen and Mada's piece and immediately resonated. And by later that year, we had all met up. Ania came through the same sort of similar discovery process. The four of us began thinking about, well, what's next, right? If we don't like the world of venture capital with its liquidity events and up into the right growth and all the other metaphors that describe that world, what do we put in its stead, right? And that's what led us to the path of describing an alternative to unicorns that we call zebras, or zebras, I should say, because it is in fact an international community now of people. And so I've trained my fellow Americans in pronouncing it zebra instead of zebra. And so Zebras Unite came about as an answer to the unicorn narrative, to say, well, if we don't like the current startup community and culture and the capital that's available, then let's create our own, right? And so we put out Zebras Fix What Unicorns Break in 2017 to basically articulate that narrative, describe an alternative world of building businesses, along the same sort of characteristics that we associate with the zebra, that are mutualistic, that are more collaborative. And so when you look at the contrast there, it's a company like mine that is interested in sustainable prosperity. I'm not interested in growing exponentially. I want my company to be profitable rather than exit, because when you think about what I'm building, it's a social enterprise that is very ambitious, but the end goal is not to go and sell it to Google or Facebook. That's sort of antithetical to what we're trying to do in the world with our company. We're interested in much more cooperation. We think of our users as part of the community instead of as something that you churn. We're very much motivated by sort of the public interest and public and communal sort of purpose. We are, very transparent about how we charge for our services, and that's sort of another characteristic of Zebra companies, instead of what you have seen in the social dilemma, where we're now being mined for our attention on platforms like Facebook and so on. And we're interested in sort of the quality of what we're creating, and having a regenerative growth model instead of hockey sticking, which is really just a way to attract subsequent rounds of investors. And so you can see that there's a whole different mindset that goes into building a Zebra company. And so what we thought we would do then, so once as Elena said, once we had put out that manifesto, literally tens of thousands of people came to us and said, I am a Zebra, I want to invest in Zebras. Where do I go? Where do I go? And so we invited everybody to Portland, Oregon in November, which is, rainy and miserable, but 250 people came. And we basically talked about, as this initial inaugural sort of community, about what it is we really needed and wanted to build all our companies, right? And when you think about what I wanted, it's really very simple, right? I wanted a community of other entrepreneurs that are like me, a community of investors that would understand what I'm trying to build. I certainly am building a different company culture, right? And so I'm looking for a change, a different cultural narrative about the business that I want to build. And then, of course, I'm looking for capital. And it's not going to be venture capital, right? So I'm looking for more patient forms of capital that are better attuned to the growth path that makes sense for my company, so that it can stay true to its principles. And so those are essentially the three pillars of what Zebras Unite is focused on: capital, community, and culture. And the community piece, as Elena mentioned, we have an online community that you can find at zebrasunite.mn.co, which is a mighty network, public-facing community that anyone can join. But we also are creating chapters. And I had to confess before coming on, I did not check what the status of our chapter building activities is in Spain, but I know there is interest from folks in Madrid and elsewhere to create Zebras Unite chapters in Spain. We have other chapters, about 60 chapters spinning up on 6 continents. And of course, today we're still all very much all meeting virtually, but the London chapter and other chapters that started before the pandemic got into a nice rhythm of entrepreneurs and investors meeting on a monthly basis in coffee shops and bars and what have you, to basically talk with each other and create content together about community culture and capital that everybody needs. So building that community is central to what we're doing. And the other thing that is the other pieces we are pursuing through a cooperative that we have built. So what we have done as Zebras Unite ourselves is we're now, this is where it gets a little bit metaphysical perhaps. Zebras Unite itself is a zebra. So we ourselves are a hybrid social enterprise, at the heart of which is a gigantic cooperative that we're building. So everybody as a business or as an individual is welcome to become a member of the Zebras Unite cooperative, which essentially becomes a global producer and marketing cooperative for businesses like mine and yours and the ones that the Explorer folks are building, right? So we're basically banding together as a cooperative. And I know Spain, for example, has a very vivid history of cooperatives, very large, very successful cooperatives. So I'm sure many people are familiar with them. But when you think about what we're doing here is we're basically going to own the mechanism of our own success, right? So why don't we just own the capital instruments that Zebra companies need? So we, as part of the co-op activities, we're creating a capital arm, an investment company that will create Zebra funds in various geographies in partnership with our chapters, right? We're also basically creating business for ourselves and each other, right? I was just talking earlier today to some folks we're interviewing for some graphic design work we need, and they're all joining the cooperative, right? So we're all basically sharing opportunities with each other and creating a global community of businesses that support each other and that are available to others who are looking for products and services that are aligned with their values. And the one thing I will say about the co-op that's very interesting here is it has a golden share that is held by our nonprofit organization. So the Zebras Unite itself is mission anchored so that we can't be corrupted, if that makes sense. So, that's sort of the story of how an entrepreneur like myself, out of the dissatisfaction with the financial environment that I found myself in, basically banded together with a few others. And before you know it, the 4 became 14,000. And now we're building together this movement, essentially, that posits an alternative to venture, posits a holistic, generative way of building businesses. And we're, sort of gently transforming the world. It's not a revolution, it's an evolution. And we're basically gently changing and transforming the way that people are building businesses that are better for the world. And maybe I'll stop there so that we have plenty of time for discussion and questions. So back to you, Elena.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Astrid. Very interesting, but there's so much more. There's so much more to Zebras Unite. Let me start by saying or recommend to our audience to specifically, as you said, read Sex and Startups. Well, read all the articles, but start with Sex and Startups because there's some mind-blowing quotes like, startups are like the male anatomy designed for liquidity events. But a startup has about as much chance of making it as a single sperm has of fertilizing an egg. And on and on. It's very interesting. In this sense, this article was the beginning of everything. And the premise was that the current technology and venture capital structure is broken. You were saying it just a minute ago. Tell us more about how the entrepreneurship community, especially in Silicon Valley, reacted to it.
Because it was so irreverent, right? So we're using humor, and Mara and Jen are both recovering journalists, right? So they certainly have a way with words. And it was provocative, right? People felt provoked. Everybody laughed, right? Because everybody recognized there's truth to it, right? And I think that humor ended up being disarming, and it ended up opening some doors to some serious conversation about what's broken with this model. And there were lots and lots of people from all over the spectrum who said, yeah, I recognize that. Even VCs who said, yeah, this is really messed up the way we're operating, but now what, right? And so that was really the tenor of the conversation was, if it was a little bit hostile, people would say, well, if you're so smart, why don't you propose something better? Which we did. Or people said, oh, I totally recognize this. Now what? Where do I go? And both of those responses became motivators for zebras fix what unicorns break.
Well, now that you mentioned that, then in Zebras Fix What Unicorns Break, you say the business model is the message. Could you explain a bit further? Could you explain further?
Yeah, so what's interesting is when I look at zebra companies in our community, or I look at my own company, how you structure your business, how you structure the ownership, how you make money tells the truth of who you are as a person, right? And who you are and what the truth of the business is. Early on, when social media platforms were just coming into existence, I should say I'm trained as an economist. I was skeptical from the get-go because I looked at these business model and I said, well, what's the catch? Like, there's something not right about Facebook, and what's not right is that it's free, right? Because if you're not paying for it, then you're the product, right? And that's exactly what happened, right? So that's the truth of the business model, is that if you're choosing a revenue model that monetizes engagement and attention, then you're extractive, right? Or if, like Uber, you're creating a platform that treats the drivers basically as contract workers, but doesn't let them participate in the value that you're creating, then you're creating an extractive business model. And in both cases, there are zebra alternatives, right? Or founders that are thinking about solving similar market problems that are very interesting market problems when you think about them, but they go about it differently, right? Maybe they form a co-op structure, maybe they have an explicit model to pay for the service, etc. And so that's the truth of what's happening is basically encoded, not just in the business model, but also in the corporate form itself.
So, well, you went to do what most entrepreneurs do, is they find a problem and they go and find a solution, which is the beginning of everything. I also have to say to our audience, if they haven't gone through Astrid's profile, she says she knows about economics. She has a PhD, she's doctor in economics, so she knows a bit about economics, I would say. In that sense, as Astrid, you've mentioned, and we've read about it, both from Zebras Unite and in general, that 90% of startups fail. The majority, they say, die within 20 months of the last round of funding. Success equals the amount of money raised or the profits made upon exit. Forgetting about the the capital. What I mean is, should we consider this a fail? And how would you redefine success in Zebras Unite?
Yeah, it's an interesting question, right? Like, if you look at a company like Tesla, they are finally profitable, after having raised hundreds of millions and billions. And then you've got failed startups like, what was that streaming service, Quibi? Right, that raised $1 billion and still failed. So funding success is not a predictor of economic long-term success of a company, right? And so what we are interested in is, and what many founders I think are interested in, is building a company that lasts, that is sustainable, not just in the sort of ecological sense, but that's financially sustainable, that makes their founders a comfortable living, that pays their staff, right? Like, these are all signals of success in my book. And of course, as you can tell from my accent, I'm originally German. In Europe, right, where we have this idea of a family firm that is in a family for hundreds of years, right? And here in the US, it's like, well, if it fails in 2 years, I'll just create another company. It's a different mindset in Silicon Valley, which is part of the problem. The Silicon Valley mindset doesn't actually travel very well to other cultures, where we have a sense of the longevity of a company is success, and so there are some really interesting sort of cultural tensions in this idea of a unicorn that don't travel very well.
So why did you choose the zebra as a symbol then, Astrid?
Yeah, well, zebras are, unlike unicorns, are real creatures. So that was the first start. It's not a mythical creature. It actually exists in the world. It's black and white. It combines profit and purpose, right? The black of the profit and the white of the purpose. It is feisty. Zebras are really feisty animals. They're unafraid. They take on lions if need be. They're collaborative, right? They're herd animals. So they represent that mutualism. And they also are just cute. I mean, look at your t-shirt. How cute are zebras, right? So we have a lot of fun with the...
Talking about cute.
Oh my goodness, you brought all that. See, I've got one on my shelf behind me.
It is the cutest thing, I know.
But we have a lot of fun with the branding and the swag and the.
I can imagine. I've seen you with a pin with a zebra. You know, you have to have it all. The socks probably are black and white. But tell us, Astrid, about okay, this is fair enough. But what about the growth? You say growth is not anymore just numbers. And what are the challenges zebra companies face?
You know, one thing that when you think about zebra companies, one thing I like very much is that they are very focused on their customer or their users, right? Because when you are not growing because you're trying to attract the next round of investors, you really have to understand your customers. You have to listen to them. You have to be responsive, right? So it's like taking your mom and pop, you know, like your ice cream shop, but taking that into the 21st century and saying, well, what if we build technology firms and very ambitious, again, these are not brick and mortar lifestyle businesses, you know, these are very ambitious companies, but they're that focused on customer service and customer success, right? And so that it just shifts, again, it shifts your perspective of where you're putting the emphasis in how you're building your business, right? If you're focused on customer success, you may have fewer of them, but they're much happier and they're likely to come back. Whereas in Silicon Valley, the model is churn. Like churn is something you do to butter, right? Like it's a brutal process. You're churning over your customers. You don't care if they burn out and don't like your product as long as there's 100 more coming in that you're selling to. So I think it's this mindset of what matters for growth. And if you're paying attention to your customers, you're actually getting to profitability more quickly, we believe, right? And you actually, then that becomes your growth strategy, is that you're growing by growing revenue.
It seems pretty obvious when you explaining like that.
We think so.
You also mentioned in the article, in Zebras Fix What Unicorns Break, you say zebras are stuck between two outdated paradigms, non-profit and for-profit. Could you explain this and why it's not true?
Yeah, so it's interesting. And again, remember my own trajectory, and that's why I led with the story of my own company, right? We were incubated in a nonprofit setting. Like the organization I led is a nonprofit, and that's where we were incubated. But the funny thing is, nonprofits have some of the same pathologies, I would say, that venture-funded companies do. And if you think anybody who's ever worked in the nonprofit world knows that you actually care much less about the people you're trying to benefit than you care about your funders, right? So you're always looking to your investors, your funders, the way that venture-funded companies always look to their investors. And that's a problem when you're trying to scale socially impactful solutions, right? So it's, again, and there's something that's inherently a scale constraint in nonprofits because you're so reliant on philanthropic support, right? And the for-profit, the way it's conceived in the dominant paradigm, I should say, is toxic to the social impact, right? So you have this weird tension between creating social impact, but you're having to stay small. You're dependent on contributions that are compatible with the charitable purpose. And on the for-profit side, it's sort of the, unicorn or bust mentality. And that's sort of the tension that we're holding as zebra companies. And in part why we find that so many entrepreneurs are actively looking for new corporate forms altogether.
So eventually, do you think this is a trend, Astrid, that all companies in an ideal future and not so far away will end up being zebra companies and the unicorn will disappear?
Well, I mean, we're not trying to exercise unicorns, I mean, I think we just need, sometimes I compare it to flavors in an ice cream store, right? Like if venture capital is vanilla and bank financing is chocolate, and maybe nonprofits are strawberry, it's a boring ice cream store, right? Like I don't know about you, but I like other flavors of ice cream. And so what we're proposing is that we just need more diversity of capital, more diversity of corporate forms that allow entrepreneurs to bring their vision into reality, right? And what happens now is that, like my company, right? Like I got all these questions from like, how are you going to generate hockey stick growth? And I said, I'm not interested in hockey stick growth because I don't want to lie to you about how it's going to come about in the first place. but it's also not the right growth model for the kind of company I'm building. And so then I wasn't right for venture capital. But if there are other forms of capital out there, then you can align the purpose with the financing. And that's really I mean, unicorns are fine. I mean, if you want to be a unicorn chaser, knock yourself out. And that's an okay path for some people.
Yeah, but you see more and more there's a trend that things have changed, as you were saying. The entrepreneurs now, they want to have a purpose more than just, I mean, things have changed.
Yeah, for sure.
When I was researching for this chat with you, my colleague mentioned that film that you and I might remember because you are a Gen Xer, more or less like me. And 1987, do you remember Michael Douglas in Wall Street with
Yes.
that sentence that was famous, the greed is good.
Yes.
And it was at the time, it was like the top, the guys at Wall Street, and how things have changed since then. And a lot of people actually wrote to Michael Douglas and to Oliver Stone, who is the director of the film Wall Street. The millennials watching us probably are thinking, what are we talking about? It's a classic. But people were writing to them saying, I want to be like you. This is what I do. I want to be but it's not like that anymore. I mean, a lot of time has passed, but since things are changing, it's a trend then, Astrid. There's light at the end of the tunnel.
Yeah, there's two things going on here. One is, the Silicon Valley paradigm doesn't work very well in other parts of the world. And we see a lot of attempts to sort of translate, what Y Combinator is doing or 500 startups and sort of plonk down and, do the same in Africa, do the same in Asia. And it just doesn't work. Do the same in Europe. And so we're getting a lot of incoming from folks, including in government, including in the European Commission, saying, how do we encourage startups and business growth, but how do we avoid the pitfalls of Silicon Valley? So we're very encouraged by that, right? So the idea that there is sort of a much more culturally responsive way to grow startups, and it's not the Silicon Valley way, right? And then, as you say, the other thing that's happening is this demographic change, that there are a lot more people now who look at business and say, well, I don't frankly want to be like Elon Musk, right? Like, I want to build a good business that does good in the world, that is financially successful. And how do I do both? And I think there are a couple of interesting indicators for where we see that. One is lawyers. Lawyers in Silicon Valley tell me that they get an increasing number of entrepreneurs coming to them who say, well, how do I build a social enterprise? Like, how do I combine the for-profit with a nonprofit sidecar? How do I build that from the get-go into my mission? And this one corporate lawyer I was talking to said to me, I don't even know how to advise them, because we tell every entrepreneur to create a Delaware C Corp, which is sort of the classic corporate form that you use in the United States to build a venture funded company. And the other thing that's been happening is, I think a lot of our viewers, I think, are probably digital natives, right? Who don't even remember a time before the internet. But what everybody is now experiencing is the sort of toxic effects of platforms that were built in the unicorn way. And when you watch movies like The Social Dilemma, for example, you just see how insidious it has become. And what I was just talking to the folks at the Center for Humane Technology yesterday, and they're putting on an event for, what they're calling like how to become a humane technologist. 10,000 people signed up. Wow. Right? Because people want to build technology in different ways, right? And so in that sense, I think there's a sea change going on, that we say, well, we need culturally appropriate forms of supporting startups and creating capital that is responsive. And also the demographic has changed, and people are much, much more aware that these choices of business models and what we're building really matters. And it matters to things like our democracy.
That's incredibly interesting. And I couldn't agree more with you, Astrid. Let's change and stop for a while in the mutualism concept. Yeah. How do you think that this approach can make a difference in the world of business? And how do you recommend to take advantage of it in a community like the Explorer one?
Yeah, the main driver, of the unicorn model is competition, right? And you hear it in the way in business school, there's sort of or in the venture world, like how we talk about creating a moat, and you're basically trying to create a monopoly. As an economist, I would describe everything that's going on there as you're trying to create a monopoly. Again, speaking as an economist, what we overlook is that there are actually collective forms of organizing business interests that are much more powerful in the long term. oligopolies, to use a technical term, like OPEC, right, are actually much, much more powerful in the long term. So sometimes people look at us and say, oh, you must be a bunch of do-gooders and you want to drive us into socialism and communal ownership. It's like, not really. I mean, those have their role and their purpose. But when you think about it, it's like, what actually works, right? Like, again, using OPEC as an oligopoly in driving and dominating a market, it's actually very, very effective. So when your market is social impact, when you're trying to change the world for the better, an oligopoly, a mutualistic structure, is actually a much safer, a much more stable thing, right? And so that's sort of what we're after here. Is like, we can actually support each other in achieving our purpose with our companies in ways that benefits everyone, right? And that's really what we mean by mutualism. I'm not saying we're going to build an OPEC-like oligopoly. I'm just using these technical terms to drive home the point that these are proven structures that are very stable and that create incredible benefit for its participants, right? And so when we talk about mutualism, we talk about the mutualism between your users or consumers and the company, but also among companies, including companies in the same sector.
So could you give us then, you've spoke about the OPEC, but could you give us examples of zebra companies that are well known, or which we could follow, or are there role models?
Oh, sure. I mean, sometimes the role models can be surprising, and they may not think of themselves as zebra companies. But I would argue that something like a Salesforce, like what Mark Benioff built, is actually very zebra-like. When you read about the early days of Salesforce and how he had trouble getting venture financing and focused on revenue, and it was sort of a new market category, right? Cloud-based computing. Software as a service, right? So that was so a lot of the sort of category innovators, I think, fall under sort of a zebra rubric potentially. Basecamp, Patagonia, I think would fit, yeah. And the way they sort of live that ethos. Again, I don't know if they would self-declare themselves as a zebra, but that's an interesting conversation to have with them. I should reach out. Basecamp, you might be familiar with. I would include. Yeah, so I think these are some good examples. Yeah.
And zebra companies are they at the same time B Corp companies? Now there are a lot of companies becoming B Corp. Is this different? Are they?
Yeah, so there is and we have very cordial relationships with the B Lab, right? I think there's an important distinction between the B Lab certification and the B Corp as a corporate form. So a lot of zebra companies are using the public benefit corporation, which is a legal structure that allows you here in the US and perhaps in other jurisdictions, enables you to anchor your social mission. And that's very, very different from the B Corp certification, which basically just says, oh, I'm trying to do good in the world, but it's not stable. So a well-known example of a B Corp is Etsy. Right, Etsy, the craft trading marketplace, that was B Corp certified, but they were still a Delaware C company, and they had a hostile takeover. Basically, their minority shareholders, a hedge fund, threw out the existing management and said, "Oh, that B Corp stuff, that's nice to have, but that's not mission critical," and out it went. So what we're really pursuing with the zebra ethos is in part to make sure that your mission is enshrined in your corporate structure. So think about Zebras Unite itself, right? So we're a cooperative, and a nonprofit holds the golden share, and it's the golden share that would have to vote in the affirmative if we ever wanted to demutualize, right? So if Zebras Unite all of a sudden said, oh, let's sell ourselves to Facebook, the golden share would probably say no. And that's a much stronger protection than of a mission than going through the B Corp certification.
We're almost running out of time. We're going to jump into the questions. Remember, I remind our audience to send your questions through the chat, so they will forward them to me through WhatsApp. Here they are. So don't hesitate if you still have questions for Astrid. In the meantime, let me just go through the last two questions, Astrid. In terms of deals between investors and Zebra, are there any ones that you know that are worth mentioning? So, get inspired by what's going on out there?
Yeah, no, there's a bunch that we're really pleased about. One, maybe I'll pick a cooperative. So Savvy Co-op is a healthcare, health data, and patient cooperative, where basically patients participate in the creation of value, for research. It's a super exciting concept, and they received some funding from Indie VC. And if you look at the Indie VC website, they have a burning unicorn, so they're very aligned. The founders of Indie VC very much aligned with the Zebra ethos. Indie VC uses an investment mechanism that's essentially a revenue share. So what they do is they give money to a company with the expectation of a return multiple. So in however many years you agree on, Indie gets back sometimes like 3 times or 5 times the amount they lent to the company, and the company can start paying down that obligation after some amount of time after the financing. And so that's a very interesting combination of a new corporate form and a new financial mechanism that are sort of really well made for each other. So we're excited about that example. And then there are hopefully others that we can talk about in the not too distant future.
I'm sure we will, with the power of Zebras Unite, for sure. Just the last question before we go into the audience questions. As a founder yourself, an entrepreneur, what tips would you give to the explorers that are listening, that are watching us? And they're just at the beginning of their 12 weeks of this pre-incubation program.
Yeah, I looked a little bit at the program, and I will actually speak from the perspective of my company, Amalaria, and the work we're doing. If you Google us or Google the Resilience Exchange, I would say to all of you, don't assume that you're inventing from scratch, right? So part of the problem in the social change space is that we keep reinventing the wheel, and there's some really egregious examples, like there's a technology that's like a water ATM. It purifies water, and people in the slums of Nairobi or Mumbai can go to a facility and get clean water. That innovation has now been invented 5 times in the last 15 years. So don't do that. I don't want to see another water ATM coming out of this program. And so I would encourage everyone to start out by looking who has already done something like what you're thinking about, and think about your innovation from maybe more of a process improvement or sort of a stage, sort of a phase shift improvement, as opposed to, oh, you're the first person who's thought about selling clean water in slums.
Okay, so don't reinvent the wheel.
Do not reinvent the wheel. Whatever you do, please do not reinvent the wheel.
Okay, I have a lot of questions here. Hang on a second. Okay, hang on. I don't know. I have a lot of questions, so we don't have much time. They ask me. They ask you. You mentioned mission. The mission should be inserted in a way in the corporate structure, in the corporate structure. But why is it so hard to build Zebra companies? Or that's what they think. Is it hard? Why is it so hard?
You know, I don't think it's that hard, because it's just unfamiliar. So part of what's happened is that the unicorn narrative is so dominant that a lot of entrepreneurs don't know anything else, right? So it's as simple as that. When you actually look at your options, you can take something like a limited liability company, an LLC. That can be a Zebra. It's really powerful as a form in your organic documents to anchor your mission and protect it against investor interest. It's just that the dominant paradigm, the narrative, makes it sound like everybody needs to be a unicorn. So it's not that hard. It requires a little bit of specialized help from lawyers, specialized help from accountants, and so on. But it's not that hard. And that's in part why we're building Zebras Unite, so that you can find those resources, and so you can find each other and make it easier to build a company that doesn't need to be a unicorn.
Okay, so it's just when there's a will, there's a way, right?
Well, I'm German, I would say that.
For sure. They ask you also, how do you get early stage investors to understand the concept of Zebras and see value for their investments?
Oh, great question. So that's actually one of the services that we think we can provide to the market at large, right? So my experience as an entrepreneur was in part so painful because I had to start every pitch by explaining why I don't fit the dominant paradigm. So part of why we created and why I call it a marketing cooperative is like part of what Zebras Unite is doing is we can help educate the market so that it becomes easier for entrepreneurs to start the conversation by saying, I'm going to be a Zebra company. I want to talk to you as an investor about a revenue share as opposed to an equity investment. And so that market education is really difficult to do for every individual entrepreneur. And so that's part of what we want to do as a collective, help do that market education so that the cost of friction, right, the transaction cost goes down for entrepreneurs when you're raising money.
Okay, so we're getting there, educating the market. This is starting in the US more than in the rest of the world, or is it? It doesn't really matter.
No, I wouldn't say that at all. No, we have had, I think we have an article in an Italian magazine that's about to come out. We've been written about in German. I know there's Spanish language writing about us, certainly in Mexico. We've been translated into Portuguese. So the concept resonates everywhere, right? And we're working on doing that market education using our chapter structure. So that's why it's so interesting, to build out as a global chapter-based organization. So we can work through our chapter leads and figure out who the key influencers are, what events we need to do to help educate the markets.
Cool. Yeah. This, in a way, follows the trend of other movements, if you want. Black Lives Matters, even what Greta Thunberg started in a way. It's a kind of movement that it drags us all along. So there we go. We Zebras Unite. The last question from the audience, because we have to jump into the next section. Remember, you can send your questions in Spanish. I'll translate them. Don't worry, okay? Don't be shy.
I will not answer in Spanish.
We'll do our best, okay? So please don't hesitate. They ask you, well, about your midlife, you made a midlife career change. What did you learn, and what would you like to know? What would you would have liked to know at the time when you made that change?
Oh, another great question. One thing I learned is that there is sort of a youth culture, I would say, in startups. There is sort of this idea, like when you look at many accelerators, for example, that you go there for 3 months. I'm not going to leave my family and my child for 3 months, right? Yeah. So it was actually really interesting to realize that when you make this sort of midlife career switch, right, and especially if you become an entrepreneur, there was a surprising lack of support for Gen X startup founders, which is interesting because as people, we have so much life experience and we go about building businesses in a very different way. I kind of had to find my own support community. It's another reason to build Zebras Unite, right? I actually run into other Gen X founders. That was really interesting. And the other thing, and I don't know if that was a woman or a man who asked the question, it was really interesting to sort of confront the sort of financial insecurity that comes with leaving a full-time job and becoming an entrepreneur. And again, there were some really interesting sort of cultural and social norms that I was butting up against that I hadn't thought about beforehand, but that ended up being very interesting to experience.
Cool. We ran out of time, Astrid. We have to go into the next section. Just remember, guys, it's zebra, not zebra. Zebra, not zebra. We have to say goodbye to the general audience. We're going to continue this TalkX. Well, we say goodbye to the Twitch and the private chat. We're going to continue in the private chat in Clanet, exclusively the explorers, the 30 selected and lucky people that have been actually selected for this program. I remind you that we have a link in YouTube in Clanet. I'm going to say it in Spanish, Astrid, because I'm getting confused myself. Estamos en el YouTube, tenéis un link a YouTube en Clanet, lo sabéis, Explorers, dentro del tablero Beyond Explorer, solo para los participantes de Explorer, okay, just for Explorer participants. Well, I know they have plenty of questions for Astrid, so thank you everybody for your questions, general audience, Explorers. I'll see you and Astrid. She's going to take a break, 2 minutes break, una descanso de 2 minutos, 2 minutes. Go into your YouTube link and clan it in El Tablero Beyond Explorer. We'll see you guys there in around 2 minutes. We're going to wait for you to connect, and we'll continue talking to Astrid. This is fascinating. Unite. See you there.
See you there.
Bye-bye.